The first thing I remember is the way the light fell that evening, slow and tired, as if even the sun had learned to lower its eyes in this town. It slid along the wooden storefronts and rested, almost tenderly, on a young native woman standing beside a small bread stall. She was Rohi Redfeather, 22 years old, slender from hunger more than nature, her dark hair braided tight as if holding herself together took effort. She kept her gaze down, not because she was weak, but because the town had taught her that looking up invited cruelty, and she had already endured enough to last a lifetime, or so she believed then. The bread smelled warm and alive, a quiet defiance against the hard air of the street. People passed, some buying, most staring, a few whispering the same old words she had learned not to hear. Each coin placed in her palm felt heavier than it should have, as though it carried judgment with it, and she wondered, every single day, how long a person could survive on silence alone, before even silence began to break them. She had been in town for a week, no more, though it felt longer in the way pain stretches time. Every morning before dawn, she baked in the small cabin she had rented on the edge of town, her hands blistered and scarred but steady. Bread was the only thing she had left that felt like home, the only skill that still belonged to her without question. But the town's bakers did not see skill or survival. They saw intrusion, and resentment settled in their eyes like dust that never quite cleared, leaving one to wonder how quickly it would turn into fire. They mocked her openly by the third day. By the fifth, they no longer bothered to lower their voices. "She don't belong here," one of them said loudly as she packed away unsold loaves, his laughter sharp and unnecessary. Rohi kept working, her shoulders stiff, her heart beating in a careful, controlled rhythm. She told herself that endurance was a kind of strength, even as a small, aching part of her questioned how much endurance one's soul was meant to carry. Night came early on the seventh day, heavy and restless. Rohi returned to her cabin with fewer coins than she needed and more fear than she could name. She lit a small lamp and began kneading dough for the next morning, hands moving by memory while her thoughts wandered to places she no longer allowed herself to visit. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees like a warning she did not yet understand, and for a moment she paused, sensing that something fragile was about to shatter. The fire came without mercy. She smelled smoke before she saw the flames, sharp and bitter, and by the time she reached the door, the heat had already claimed the walls. Panic rose like a scream in her chest, but instinct carried her through the smoke and into the open night. She fell into the dirt, coughing, watching the only shelter she had left collapse into burning ruin. In the distance, laughter echoed once, then vanished, leaving her with the terrifying certainty that cruelty, when left unchecked, always returned for more. She stood there for a long moment, barefoot and shaking, the fire painting her face in cruel orange light. Everything she owned was gone, reduced to embers and ash, and with it went the fragile sense of belonging she had tried so hard to build. Tears came then, silently, because there was no one to hear them anyway. When she finally looked up, through the smoke and darkness, she saw a single lantern glowing far off, steady and warm, and she wondered if hope could survive such a long walk. The cabin stood alone at the edge of town, worn but solid, its windows glowing with lamplight. The man who lived there was known, though not closely, a quiet presence who spoke little and worked hard. His name was Caleb Whitmore, 30 years old, a cowboy shaped by loss and long silences, with eyes that had learned to observe before judging. He had returned from a long day tending cattle and was washing his hands when he heard the knock, soft at first, then hesitant, as if the person feared being heard too clearly. When he opened the door, he found Rohi standing there, soot-streaked and shaking, her braid loosened as though even her strength had slipped free. Her shoulders were drawn inward, protecting what little dignity she had left, and for a moment she could not lift her eyes to his face. When she finally spoke, her voice trembled like a fragile flame fighting the dark. "I've nowhere else to go," she whispered, each word heavy with humiliation and hope. "Please, just for one night." The silence that followed pressed close, thick with all the things neither of them knew how to name yet, and in that fragile stillness, fate quietly took hold. Caleb did not rush her, did not ask questions that would wound her further. He only stepped aside and opened the door wider, a simple movement that felt like an unspoken promise. The lamplight spilled across her face, softening the shadows of fear, and for the first time that night, Rohi felt seen without being measured. She paused at the threshold, her heart pounding, knowing that crossing it meant trusting a stranger with what remained of her soul. When she finally stepped inside, warmth wrapped around her, sinking into her skin, and relief came so suddenly it almost brought her to tears. The cabin held the quiet comfort of a life lived honestly, wood, soap, and the faint trace of smoke from a well-used stove. Caleb handed her water with care, his fingers never quite touching hers, as if he sensed how easily she might shatter. Then he offered bread, still warm, and she ate slowly, reverently, afraid that if she hurried, the moment would end. He noticed the burns on her hands, the way she startled at every creak of the floor, and though his chest tightened with questions, he chose restraint. His silence did not feel empty. It felt patient, like a hand waiting to be taken. At last, he spoke, his voice low and steady, as though he feared startling her. "You can sleep by the stove," he said gently. "It'll stay warm through the night." Rohi looked up then, meeting his eyes at last, and something unspoken passed between them, gratitude, trust, and the faintest stirring of something neither dared to believe in yet. As she lay down beside the quiet fire, the shadows no longer felt so threatening, and for the first time since the flames had stolen everything, she allowed herself a dangerous thought. That morning might come, and that she might not have to face it alone. Morning arrived without mercy. By midday, whispers had already found their way to the sheriff, and by afternoon, he stood at Caleb's door, his hat resting low in his hands as though even it carried the town's judgment. "You know how this looks," Sheriff Thomas Hale said carefully, his eyes drifting toward Rohi, who remained just behind Caleb's shoulder, her body poised to shrink away at the first command. She felt the old instinct rise, to disappear, to make herself small enough not to trouble anyone again. Caleb did not turn to look at her. He did not step aside. He stood firm, his voice calm and unyielding. "I know how it is." The words were quiet, but they landed like a line drawn in the dirt, and for the first time, Rohi felt what it was to be defended without being spoken over. The days that followed settled into a tense stillness, as though the cabin itself was holding its breath. Eyes followed them wherever they went, some sharp with anger, others softened by curiosity that dared not yet become kindness. Each stare reopened wounds Rohi had learned to hide, and more than once, she gathered the few things she had left, standing at the door in the early light, convinced that leaving would be an act of mercy. Every time, Caleb found her there, saying nothing, only meeting her gaze with a steadiness that asked her to stay without demanding it. His quiet presence became an anchor, and slowly, reluctantly, she let herself believe she was allowed to remain. What grew between them did not arrive in grand moments, but in the small, careful ones. Caleb tended the burns on her hands with a tenderness that made her chest ache, his fingers steady, his touch respectful, as if he understood how fragile trust could be. Rohi baked again in his kitchen, the scent of bread weaving warmth into the corners of the cabin, transforming it into something that felt like a shared heartbeat. They ate together at the table, knees nearly touching, glances lingering just long enough to stir something unspoken. Their conversations drifted from simple things, the sky, the cattle, the day's work, into silences that felt full rather than empty. One evening, as the last light faded from the window, Rohi finally found the courage to ask the question that had lived in her chest like a wound. "Why are you doing this?" she said softly. "You're risking everything." Caleb did not answer at once. When he did, his voice carried a truth he could no longer deny. "Because turning you away," he said, meeting her eyes, "would make me someone I don't want to be." The words settled between them, tender and dangerous, and in that moment, something shifted, an understanding that neither of them would ever walk away unchanged. The town's cruelty, once unleashed, could not remain hidden forever. Evidence surfaced slowly, like truth rising through water. A witness spoke. Another found the courage to follow. The laughter that had followed the fire turned into silence as the trail led back to the bakers, and when the sheriff finally placed them under arrest, the town was forced to look at the harm it had allowed. Apologies came hesitantly, uneven and imperfect, but they came, spoken with lowered heads and uneasy hands. Rohi listened without bitterness, her chin lifted, her heart steady, not because the pain had vanished, but because she had endured it, and in enduring she had found something far stronger than survival. She had found love, quietly waiting where she least expected it. Caleb asked her to marry him without a single rehearsed word. He took her by the hand and led her to the place where her cabin had once stood, now nothing more than scorched earth and quiet memory. There, beneath an open sky, he began to build again, setting the first beam into the ground with deliberate care, as if he were anchoring a promise. He paused often, turning to her with a soft question in his eyes, inviting her to choose where the door should face, where the window would catch the morning light. In those gentle choices, Rohi understood what he was offering her. Not rescue, not protection, but a life built side by side. When she said yes, her voice was steady, though her heart ached with a sweetness she had never known. Their wedding came quietly, without spectacle, yet it carried a gravity that silenced the town. It was held beneath the open sky, the land bearing witness, the sheriff standing with his hat over his heart as vows were spoken in voices low but certain. Caleb's hands trembled only once, when he reached for hers, and Rohi lifted her eyes fully then, meeting his gaze without fear. In that moment the past loosened its grip and love, patient, earned, and unashamed, took its place. Life afterward unfolded like a long, gentle breath. Rohi set up her bread stall outside their home, the scent of warm loaves drifting through the air like an invitation, her laughter returning in pieces at first, then freely. Her hands, once marked by pain, moved with joy now, creating not from necessity but from love. Caleb watched her often from the doorway, pride and tenderness written in the quiet way he smiled, knowing that happiness did not need to be loud to be real. Love grew in the unremarkable moments, in shared mornings touched by sunlight, in tired evenings where silence felt like belonging. It deepened when she placed his hand over her heart and whispered that she was no longer afraid, and again when he rested his forehead against hers, grateful for a grace he never thought he deserved. When the twins were born, a daughter and a son, their cries filled the cabin with a promise of tomorrow, one unburdened by old hatred and borrowed shame. And still, memory lingered, not as a wound, but as a reminder. They carried it gently, honoring the pain that had shaped them without allowing it to define them. For dignity once denied becomes sacred when reclaimed, and love, when chosen in the face of judgment, does not merely heal, it endures, quietly, beautifully, for all the days that follow. Now, as I look back on that time, my heart understands what my younger self could not. Grace does not always arrive with certainty or triumph. Sometimes it comes quietly, disguised as a door left open when the world has already decided to close every other one. Courage, I have learned, does not always raise its voice. It often speaks in silence, in the steady choice to stay when leaving would be easier. If you are listening, hold this close. Kindness does more than change lives. It reshapes destinies, softens generations, and teaches love how to survive in hard places. Sometimes it begins with nothing more than a single night of shelter, a shared breath in the dark, and the faith that by morning, two lonely hearts might wake to a future they never dared to imagine, where love stands quietly at the door, waiting to be let in.